In organisms that have a 3 or 4 chambered heart, you have a 2-loop circulatory system where one loop takes deoxygenated blood to the lungs and gets it oxygenated, and then the second loop brings that oxygenated blood to the body. Well, here we have both gills and lungs. And so this is how all of this branching is able to accommodate having both of these structures. So I'll start with the flow of blood from the ventricle. So blood comes into the ventricle from the left and right atrium, and it partially mixes. There is a little thing called a spiral valve that is found in here in the top part of the ventricle, right by the ventral aorta, that kind of keeps the blood separated from the left and right atrium, but for the most part you can consider this mixed blood. So blood leaves the ventricle, goes out the ventral aorta. There's also a dorsal aorta that's here. All right, so ventral aorta comes out and branches off into left and right afferent brachial arteries. Brachial, bless you, arteries bring blood to the gills. All right, so it comes out, left and right afferent brachial arteries goes to the gills. Afferent means it's going to the gills. Coming out of the gills, that would be efferent. So the efferent brachial arteries take blood from the gills and bring it back into the circulatory system where it branches. Right, so after it's oxygenated into gills and comes back in, it branches, and one branch goes to the lungs. And here's the efferent brachial artery, one branch goes to the lungs. The other branch, the main branch, and most of the blood goes to the dorsal aorta. Right, here's where it continues to go down the dorsal aorta. Now the dorsal aorta is actually behind the heart, it's not to the side. I drew it this way so you can see a little bit better, so you can visualize it. So once it goes through the dorsal aorta, it travels through the body and then comes back through the post cava. The post cava runs into this huge sinus behind the heart called the sinus venosus. And the blood starts to collect and pool in here and then enters the right atrium. Blood that enters the left atrium is blood that went through the pulmonary artery where the efferent brachial artery branched. It branches into the dorsal aorta and the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery brings blood to the lungs. From the lungs, the blood comes back through the pulmonary vein and into the left atrium. So a couple questions for you guys. I mentioned that blood mixes here. Does it matter that blood mixes? Think about it. Blood coming in from the left atrium, is it oxygenated or deoxygenated blood?
Oxygenated.
It's oxygenated from the lungs?
Yeah.
How well developed were the lungs of the salamander?
Not very.
Not very. So how much oxygenation do you think occurs?
Not a lot.
Not a lot. So this comes from the lungs, but is not really oxygenated. This blood that comes into the right atrium is coming from the body. How oxygenated is that?
It's not.
Not very. So blood entering the heart actually is not very oxygenated. But which one of these might have more oxygen than the other? The left or the right atrium?
The right.
The left.
You guys are split. You go with the left. And who said right? Why the right? Where's that oxygen coming from? The body, yes. Right? Skin breathing. This blood traveling through the dorsal aorta and out through all the little blood vessels and the capillaries through the skin, all of this blood gets oxygenated as well through the skin. But because the lungs are so rudimentary, there's little, if any, oxygenation in the lungs. And if the organism is underwater, there's zero oxygenation in the lungs. Therefore, this loop bringing blood to the lungs and then to the left atrium is kind of a waste. Right? So the bulk of the oxygenation in the salamanders comes from the gills, which happens as soon as the blood leaves the heart. Right? Blood goes up through the ventral aorta to the gills and to the body. Now think of a two-chambered heart that I just mentioned a little while ago in a fish. Blood goes from the heart to the gills to the body and then back to the heart. So you can almost think of this as a single loop system because the loop that goes to the lungs is, in a sense, useless. There's very little, if any, oxygenation. Now, in salamanders that are better developed, that don't have gills, then their lungs would provide most of the oxygenation. And this wouldn't be an afferent brachial artery. This would connect directly, coming out of the heart. It would split and connect directly to the lungs and go to the body as well. And then from the lungs, come back to the left atrium. Now it depends on how developed the organism is. If it's like in frogs, the way this differs from frogs is that the circulatory system is a complete two-loop system, just like ours is. Except they have 3 chambers. And in them, that spiral valve that is here in the aorta actually does serve to keep blood partially separated, because blood that comes into the left atrium is significantly more oxygenated in a frog versus a salamander, because frogs also rely on their lungs to a significant degree, besides skin breathing. Right? So, not so much interested in the frog circulatory, and you guys being, very familiar with the frog circulatory system, because it does resemble our own, except for one ventricle. But this is something unique altogether. So if I ask you questions such as, after leaving the gills, or which blood vessel carries blood to the gills? You would tell me the afferent brachial arteries. Which blood vessel carries blood away from the gills? Efferent brachial arteries. Which blood vessel splits to deliver blood to the lungs as well as the dorsal aorta? That would be the afferent brachial artery splits into dorsal aorta and pulmonary artery, right? Blood entering the right atrium comes from where? The body. And which major part of the heart delivers that blood there?
Sinus?
The sinus venosus. How does the blood get, what's the major vessel that carries blood back to the body, back to the heart from the body?
Postcava?
Postcava. What's the major vessel that carries blood away from the heart, lungs, and gills into the body? Dorsal aorta. Ventral aorta brings the blood out to the gills and to the lungs. Dorsal aorta brings the blood to the body. Right? It's called a dorsal aorta because it does run behind the heart. Ventral aorta comes out the front of the heart. Next time you see the poor little salamanders, when you do a review before your practical, make a conscious effort to take a better look at the heart, and you'll see between the left and right atrium this very large ventral aorta that comes out. I don't expect you to be able to trace the circulatory system. It's not that big of an organism. It's very difficult to trace the circulatory system. But you should be able to see most of these veins. Like, the gills are right there. you should be able to see the afferent brachial arteries go right to the gills. That one's an easy one. It's also where the ventral aorta comes out of the heart. But some of these others, you can also see the post cava and the dorsal aorta. Those are easy to see on the salamander. The rest of these, you're not going to see. All right? Questions? That's it. There's a video on YouTube as well.